I'm very happy to introduce Eszter Hargittai, who's from Northwestern. I first got to know Eszter when she was here visiting scholar at Stanford. She came over and was helping us with a bunch of field study work. And her insights into how people search, how they think about working on the web and getting information have proven really interesting and useful. So I also want to point out that she's also a master geocacher. So she's capable of finding anything under the most rigorous of conditions. So please welcome me in welcoming Eszter Hargittai.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for coming. So I thought I would start by situating myself, since this is an interdisciplinary group. So I don't know if you've seen this slide from XKCD, but there I am identifying myself as to where I belong on the scale. So I'm a sociologist by training. I thought that would be helpful for you to know, because I know there are people from very different backgrounds here. And generally speaking, my background in terms of what has motivated me to do the research I do is an interest in questions of social inequality and how internet use in particular relates to that. So that's the very general motivating framework that I use. So I'll start by a few framing words for my talk. So there's, to this day, after quite a while of having had the internet around, there's still a lot of enthusiasm about its potential to improve our lives in various ways. But what's interesting is that there's also another side of this, is that there's actually also quite a bit of anxiety when it comes to kind of the opposite of all these potential positives. So depending on who you are or how you think about these things, people get either extremely excited about the internet and its potential in positive ways, or freak out about its negative potential consequences. So if you think this is kind of an ugly slide, that's on purpose, because I just wanted to show the cacophony of just these opinions that are out there and how jumbled they are, and not very clear view, I would say, because how can you really have all these different perspectives? So a simpler way to show it is just to say that, so one perspective suggests that there's the internet and everything that comes from it is great. And then there's the other side, which suggests that there's the internet and we have all these negative consequences. Conveniently, these smileys actually can transform into a Venn diagram. And what I argue is that in reality, the way we should be thinking about the internet's potential social implications is something in between, that there's a balance and that there's nothing inherent about what will emanate from the internet, socially speaking. Rather, there's a balance. And in fact, it matters on the social context of a person's uses of the internet, what might come of it, whether there will be potential benefits or negative consequences, and what the balance is of those types of outcomes. So that's just to frame the talk for you. So I'm very interested in people's social background, what they're bringing to their internet uses, and in particular, I will be focusing quite a bit on the concept of skill and how skill in particular matters, and why that matters, and why we need to pay more attention to it. Another issue that I wanted to mention concerns what seem like pretty widely held assumptions about how savvy today's youth are with technology. And this is what I will call a myth, and we'll show you data to suggest that this assumption is actually incorrect. These are some of what some people, quite a few people, seem to consider the capital T truth about young people. But in fact, there's little empirical evidence to suggest that this is all true. So what we do have empirical work on is more that, yes, young people have been online a lot throughout their lives and actually do spend a lot of time online, many of them. However, there's not really empirical evidence to suggest that they do lots of different things online per se, and there's definitely no empirical evidence to suggest that they're all universally savvy. So I'll be showing you some data on this. Just one more word on overall framework. So again, I am interested in internet users. I'm not that interested for the purposes of this talk and much of my work in people who don't use the internet at all. To be sure, there are still lots of Americans who don't and lots of people in the world who don't, and that's an issue as well. It's just not my focus. So I start out with the user and recognize very consciously that that user has a certain position in society and brings all sorts of characteristics to their uses. And then there's also a technical context and a social context of use that also matters to how people use the internet, which is often ignored in a lot of work. And then I argue that these influence someone's skill, all of which then influences what they end up doing with digital media. And then the really big question, which I'll leave more of as a question, but it's something that really guides all of this work at a much larger level, is how all these things that might feed into people's life chances. What kind of feedback mechanism do we see of this? That how do people's skills and what they do online how might those things impact their offline life chances as well? So whether that's health, well-being, financial well-being, or whatnot. So that's why ultimately we should care about these things from my perspective. And again, as I said, skill is a factor that I will be focusing on quite a bit. Okay, so what data should one turn to if interested in skill? So that's an issue because people don't tend to collect data on skill. Large data sets don't really have information on that. So I've been left to collect a lot of my own data. Before explaining to you specifically the data sources that I am drawing on for today's talk, I did want to spend a few minutes, just a couple of minutes, talking about why I don't rely on log data and why I think there are challenges to relying on log data, and why I'm excited to see that Google over the years is supplementing its work on log data with other types of data work about users. So, for example, an important issue is that becoming the user of a service is not a random event. Now, that's an empirical question. I will show you data to show that this is the case. But basically, what I mean by that is whether you use a site is not random across the population. And so often we'll see data analyses by having people analyze the users of a certain site. Well, by analyzing users of a certain site, that project, that study has already automatically sampled against those people who are not, or biased against those people who are not users of that site in the first place. So that's one issue. Another issue is that people understand and use sites and services differently. So for example, if you want to look at people's friendship networks in general, and then you use data just about people's networks on Facebook, you can't just say that you are looking at people's friendship networks per se, because some people may use Facebook to connect with colleagues, others might use Facebook to connect with family, yet others might use it to connect with distant friends, others with their closest friends. So you can't compare the data about networks of people on that one site, assuming that they're all the same types of ties. So that's just an example of why, again, relying on just log data may be problematic. And then finally, or one more point, is that what people do online is just one aspect of what people do for different things. So for example, how am I in touch with my best friends? Well, maybe I'm in touch with them, again, say on Facebook, but in fact, if I'm in touch with my best friends mostly through texting or picking up the phone, then if you just look at my Facebook network, you're getting a skewed perception of what I do with my best friend, or even who my best friend may be, because you don't have the other data of how we interact, for example. So those are some reasons why, while log data have tons of potential, obviously, they can't address all issues. And there are all sorts of other factors as well, things that we can't really assume by looking at log data, and I'll get to some of that as I talk to you about my data. So as Dan mentioned in the introduction, I've done quite a bit of work specifically looking at how people search for information, actually meeting with people one-on-one, sitting with them. It's what's called usability testing in some areas. We just call it observation in my area. But in one study I did, what I found across 100 cases was that people differed considerably in how long they took to complete a group of tasks. And so that was interesting in and of itself, and it showed that there are definitely skill differences among users. I'm not going to get into details of that particular study because it's not really what I'm focusing on today. The reason I bring this up is to mention how I developed a skill measure, an awareness measure that I use on surveys. So one of the big challenges of these in-person studies is that, of course, it's incredibly labor intensive, it's very expensive, it takes a lot of time to do, and you really can't do it on large samples, and it would be very difficult to do on representative samples. So findings, so there is limited generalizability from the findings, given that it would be very hard to get, say, a nationally representative sample that's large enough. So what I did in that study was I looked to see what were good survey measures, what were good proxies on the survey to measure people's actual skills as I observed them while looking at how they found information. And so this is how I came up with the survey instrument that I use that I call a measure of skill. Which itself it's a complicated methodological question, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but just so you know, it's not that one day I woke up and came up with this. I've been working on this for about a decade now, and have 3 publications that detail how it was developed and how it relates to other types of data. But basically, this is the question that people see on the survey, and this is a list of items that they're asked to rank. And the idea is that a measure that comes from this survey item list, this is just the half, there's a whole other list of another dozen terms. This is a better predictor of actual skill based on that previous study than how many years you've been a user, how much time you spend online, or even simply asking people what they think their internet skill is. So this just performed better statistically. So that's why I use it. Okay, so then today I'll mainly be drawing on survey data about internet uses and skills. In an ideal world, I'd have nationally representative data. I don't, although I will mention a data set that has been since collected that has some similar data. So I'll be able to compare to a nationally representative data set some of my findings. But basically, so yeah, in an ideal world, we'd have a nationally representative sample. It's extremely expensive. I haven't had the funding to do that. So what I've done is I've done a lot of my data collection on a specific college campus at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I want to say a few words about why there. So first of all, note from my signature line, in case you forgot, that's not my institution and I've never been affiliated with it. So this is not simply me studying my students, just to clarify. And for those of you not familiar with Chicago geography, that's Northwestern and that's where UIC is, and it's about 20 miles apart, and we do in-person data collection in the winter. So, I used to have the average temperatures for Chicago winters, but you can imagine. I mean, last weekend was 0, but the average is about 20. So, all of which is to say, this is not a convenience sample, because as my research assistants would tell you, there's nothing convenient about going down to UIC from Northwestern 30 times in the dead of winter. So the reason I work with UIC is twofold. One is that it turns out that it's one of the most ethnically diverse universities in the country. And so as someone who's interested in social inequality, it's helpful to work with a population that has quite a bit of diversity in terms of students' backgrounds. And another reason that I work with this group is that there's one course, UIC actually has a course that every first year has to take. So that's very helpful because I don't have to bias towards a course that people happen to sign up for. There's a course I can go into, a course where people have been very kind and generous to work with me, where we can go into the classrooms and survey people in there. Now, just to clarify, it's not one big class. It's actually more than 80 sections, so we survey them 20 at a time, so it's still a lot of work. And we did a study back in 2007 with over 1,000 of their first years at that time, and then followed up with over 1,000 new first years in 2009. And then what's also very exciting is that this past year, we actually followed up with that same sample. So we have longitudinal data for about 500 students for what they do online and their skills. Okay, so as I said, it's a diverse campus, and indeed you can see that from the demographics of the students who participated in the study. So we have almost half who are first-generation college students. This is important because, so obviously by going with the first-year college cohort, we're controlling on age and education. Well, you can see that age is pretty much constant, and education obviously we're controlling for because they're all first years at the same school. However, parental education is a proxy for socioeconomic status, as is often used in the literature. I just want to remind you again, this is, while a diverse sample, it is nonetheless controls on education, controls on age, both are related to internet uses, so that's important to acknowledge. But if anything, it means that findings would be conservative when it comes to a more representative national sample. So that's just something to keep in mind. So is it the wired generation? Is it the case that those assumptions that this generation has grown up with technology? Yes, we can confirm that. So from the data, we see that they have lots of experiences with the internet. I don't think I have to dwell on this slide. I will add, though, that most of them still do use email a lot. There's some, at least in the academic community, there's some discussion that today's young adults no longer use email, but I think that's more if they don't want to, they don't want you to reach them. They'll say they don't, but they actually do. Okay, so when it comes to understanding some of these internet-related items that I showed you were part of this measure, this is what the figures look like. So again, this was a survey item that I described that has all these responses. So there's certain terms that lots of people understand, but then others that people understand much less. Now, what I try to do is, it's an ongoing process for me to figure out additional ways to measure skill. So I try to come up with new measures as I field new surveys. And one of the things I did in the 2010 survey was actually use a multiple choice question for whether people understand BCC. And just to be clear, I didn't care if they knew that it stands for blind carbon copy. That's not the point. The point is, do they care? Do they understand the function? Like, what does that actually mean? It turns out that a third of them don't. They don't know what BCC is. So all those disastrous situations, sometimes when I'm sure we've all experienced it, CC lists that shouldn't have been CC lists, this would be one source of that. So just because an organization hires a young person doesn't mean that they know how to use every aspect of technology. So it's kind of, I often think of some of my data as a reality check about how to think about employees and colleagues. So then there was a list of what I call more advanced internet-related terms, but this was really just me deciding what to call them. It's not about, they don't have to be classified in any particular way per se. And again, we see that there's a pretty quick drop in average level of understanding of some of these terms. I will add that the 2007 measures were actually quite consistent. So that was obviously a different cohort, but the measures in general for the averages tend to be very close over time. So it's only in the 100th decimal point that it changed over 2 years, actually. And to 2010, which is the same group, again, the measures were quite consistent. So, because sometimes people react and say, oh, it's by next year they all know this, and no, they don't. Yes, go ahead.
A measure of the learning effect with supposed learning effect, or indicating there's not?
No, that there's not really. That's why I'm saying that it pretty much stays consistent. I mean, again, it goes up 100th decimal point level. There are a few things that they're really from 2007 to 2009. There were just a couple of things that went up. Tagging went up quite a bit, and I think that's because of, say, Facebook and photo tagging in particular. And social bookmarking has definitely gone up as browsers have not social bookmarking. Sorry. Tab browsing, that went up since 2007. Again, I think because browsers with tabs have really started to spread. But unless there's that kind of a change, that there's this one technology that's really taking off, you don't see much change in how people rate their understanding. So then, as I said, I'm really interested in how people's backgrounds relate to their skill and uses. So let's look at just some bivariate relationships. So what we see is that women tend to rate their skills lower than men. And I'm going to come back to the gender variable more in the talk because it's actually a very complicated variable that I want to talk about a little bit more. But this is a statistically significant difference. We see differences by race, ethnicity, as to where people are in terms of their average level of understanding. And we also see it by parental education, again, the proxy for socioeconomic status. So taking it all together, what we have is that if you take the average Hispanic female student in the group whose parents have less than a high school education, that's her score. And if you take the average male Asian student in the group whose parents have a graduate degree, that's his score. That's a pretty large difference. I also have, if later after the talk people want to see the regression results, I have that too. Okay, so what's exciting is that I've been talking to people about the importance of measuring skill and that we need to get it on nationally representative samples. And I'm happy to say that in the fall of 2009, when the Federal Communication Commission fielded a survey nationally, they did include some of these items on their survey. So I'm able to, and those data are made public, so I'm able to look at, okay, so we know at UIC there are these differences, but how does it look nationally? So basically, just quickly looking at their figures, so the findings I showed you are consistent. So in terms of gender and race, those data show the same relationships with the skill measures. Data I didn't have in my data set, income, perhaps not surprisingly, as another measure of socioeconomic status, is positively related to skill. Education, which as you will recall in my data set is constant, nationally it's not, is also positively related to skill. But what's interesting is age, if you look at just people 50 and under in that data set, is actually not related to skill. So that's one of those assumptions people have, that the younger, the more highly skilled, the older, the less skilled. Over 50, it's true that there we have a decline, but 50 and under, there's no clear correlation between age and skill. Okay, so I said that I would come back to the question of gender, and I want to talk about this just a little bit more. I'll keep coming back to it. So in a paper that I published a few years ago, we showed, and this was based on that study where you saw the where I observed 100 people and doing actual tasks. And one of our findings was that if you predict people's self-perceived skill while controlling for actual skill, gender is still significant. So that shows that regardless of their skill, women are rating their skills lower than men. So that's an issue. But one of the things we concluded is whether it's actual or perceived, this might still influence what people actually end up doing. So we can't completely dismiss it as, oh, it's just in their head or it's just a perception, because it might still influence what women versus men do online. So that's just something to keep in mind. But again, not to assume that there's something inherent per se about women, or that it's a simple question. It's actually quite complicated. So I like to show this slide, or this XKCD comic, because it shows, again, the social factors that influence how women might be thinking about their skills versus men, that if we have situations where just women in general are assumed to be worse, that could influence people, how they perceive their skills, like if we draw on the stereotype threat literature from social psychology, for example. Okay, so now moving on to what is it that people actually do online. So just a few slides on some of the sites that I asked about on the survey, because again, there are so many assumptions that young people do all these things. So these are the 3 sites that many of the people in the sample actually used. But what's interesting is that there are a lot of sites that are often associated with younger people that they actually don't really use at all. So I think, yet again, it's a bit of a reality check. So in particular, comparing Facebook and MySpace, it's been important, I think, to highlight that there are quite a bit of racial ethnic differences in who selects into using these sites. So this brings us back to that point I made earlier, that you can't rely on one site to draw conclusions about all people out there, because people select to use these sites at different rates. Another reason to be concerned about something like this, if you're trying to reach the general population, whether it's an ad campaign or whatnot, you should be very careful not to target just one site, because if you say want to reach Hispanic people as well, then Facebook might not be the best place to do it. And I had already shown this relationship back in 2007 from the 2007 data set. And again, it was one of those things where back then people said, oh, this is just timing, it'll change very quickly. But 2009, there's still differences that held up. So we can't just dismiss these differences as just a very temporary blip. they tend to persist quite a bit. What was also interesting was when I published that 2007 piece, I tried to get some places to cover it, and the Chronicle of Higher Education covered it because it was about students, but other places said, oh, well, you're just talking about this group of students. What's interesting is that Nielsen 2 years later had more representative data, so that got covered very widely, but in fact, they just confirmed my findings from 2 years prior. So I think it's helpful to note that this data set is actually quite generalizable, more so than it might seem at first. Partly because it's such a nicely diverse sample. So I thought I'd say a few words about Twitter in particular. I have some interesting findings there. So you might have noticed that for 2009, the level of use was 4%, and maybe you thought, well, surely a year makes a difference because 2010 was really the year it took off. So what is the rate in 2010? Well, it did go up quite a bit for sure, but let's recognize that it's still less than a fifth of the students who are using it. To be fair, all I have data on is whether people use it. I don't know if they're using it to tweet or is it just following people, but it's still interesting. Now, I have a couple of quotes here from a different study. This was focus groups with Northwestern seniors, actually, that again show that just because you're young, you don't necessarily get it. So I think these are just interesting illustrative quotes. But back to the quantitative data, so I'm able to draw on, well, okay, so one of the things that others have shown as well is that there's quite a bit of variation in Twitter use by race and ethnicity, where we have African Americans much more likely to use it than anybody else. So what might be going on? And this is where longitudinal data actually come in really handy. And so in a paper that I've written with my student Eden Litt, we looked at the following. We looked at outcome Twitter use in 2010 as predicted by various factors about you in 2009. So not surprisingly, African Americans are more likely to tweet. Yes, I showed that previously. If we look at your skill in 2009, that's positively related to adopting Twitter by 2010. But here's the really interesting thing. So we have data for 2009 about different topics that you're interested in. And it turns out that this is actually what's driving adoption, so far as getting rid of the relationship with African American. So if we put in information about being interested in entertainment and celebrity news in 2009, then being black is no longer associated with being a Twitter adopter. So it's really that it looks like African Americans on average seem to be more interested in entertainment news than whites, and that's what's driving it. This is the first study I know that has actually managed to explain some of this racial ethnic difference in site adoption, so I'm pretty excited about it. What's also interesting, not sure what to make of this, is that if you were interested in science and research in 2009, you're actually less likely to use Twitter in 2010. And I think also interesting is that interest in technology and politics are in no way related to Twitter adoption either. I think especially the one about politics is interesting because there's so much rhetoric about the potential of Twitter to get people excited about news and politics and get people participating, but it doesn't look like that's actually driving why people would adopt it. Obviously, there's room for more research here where, for example, if we had data, more specifics of what are actually people doing on Twitter, right? Are they tweeting or are they just following? How are they choosing? That would be nice to have. So now what I call participation gap, which is the idea that you're actually contributing content to the web yourself. So you're making your voices heard yourself. You're potentially influencing public opinion yourself. So this is another one of those areas that's supposed to be really exciting about the web. So here are some questions that I asked on both the 2009 and 10 data, surveys, but I'll just be focusing on the 9 data. But I checked the numbers, and they're very similar for 10. So here are some activities I asked about, whether people engage in them. And here are the numbers. So I think it's helpful to note that none of them are things that at least half the people do. So again, some people engage in them, but not everybody. Now, you might be wondering how I listed these activities, because obviously they're not in order of popularity. So I'd like you to take a look at the list and think a little bit about how I might have picked this listing, because it's not random. There's a reason for this ordering. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that. I'm sorry? From difficult to easy, or from easy to difficult? Something like that. So like a difficulty level issue, potentially. Yes, Jen? Okay. That's another possibility. So you might be thinking I'm saying yes, maybe, because those aren't the right answers, but actually they may be the right answers. It's not how I chose to list them, but as soon as I tell you the reason for this listing, you'll see that it might actually relate to those factors. So I chose this listing based on the level of difference by gender in engaging in these activities. So just to clarify, the top activity is probably about Facebook quizzes, right? So let's not think about really complicated quizzes that you're putting out there for students to take. I mean, it's more of those playful things. But what's interesting, so creating quizzes it seems to be very similar by gender. But then uploading video, there's also quite a bit of difference. And if you go down to changing or adding a Wikipedia entry, the gender difference is enormous there. So while I listed this by gender difference, it may be that those things you mentioned, whether it's difficulty level or reach, are still related, right? But it's interesting to note that this is what we get reported by gender. The only thing in the 2009 data set that women reported doing more than men was changing the privacy on their Facebook accounts. Which is probably not too surprising. By 2010, it turns out that it's so universal that there's no variation because pretty much everyone's done it. So then I was interested in seeing whether we see difference by other factors as well. So I created a summary variable. Have you engaged in these? How many of these activities have you engaged in? And again, it's a very simple measure, right? It's just ever. It's not like how many times do you do it weekly or anything like that. Just have you ever done it? And so I think not surprisingly from the figures I already showed you, there is a significant gender difference. But there's also significant variation by race and ethnicity in how many of these things people tend to do. And also variation by parental education, so the proxy for socioeconomic status. And again, bringing all those variables together, what you have, if you take the average female Hispanic student whose parents have less than a high school education, she will have done one of those activities. If you take the average white male whose parents who has parents with a graduate degree, he will have engaged in 3 of those activities. That's a huge difference on a 5 scale. And again, I have the regressions if anyone's interested. So another paper that I'm not talking about, but is somewhat similar, we looked at who shares content online. So there it was about videos and photos and fiction. And what we found was that men shared more than women. However, in a regression model, when we controlled for skill, the skill measure I've been showing you, that gender effect went away. So in fact, if you have a man and a woman of similar skill level, whether that's actual or perceived, they will share it similarly. So again, I'm pointing out the importance of that skill measure. I thought I'd show you a little bit from the 2010 data because it's more detail about YouTube in particular. And so we see that pretty much everybody has watched a video on YouTube. I think that's helpful partly just to verify that the data are right. But again, note the difference in what it is exactly that people are doing on YouTube and the variation, especially by gender. And again, even in terms of posting a video, the difference among Blacks and other students in the sample. So just pointing out that background seems to matter in different ways. And so to assume sort of a universal internet for all is an incorrect assumption. I wanted to say just a few words about Wikipedia as well. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about some more recent observational work that we've done, partly on the UIC students, but also on 100 Northwestern students a couple of years ago. And I'll just take another few minutes, I'll wrap up. in terms of understanding Wikipedia, there's quite a bit of variation. So this is another thing where we know that students use Wikipedia, but we don't necessarily know if they really understand it or not. And so it's interesting to note these quotes that I think signal that people have different levels of understanding. And again, this is one of those things I'm trying to form into survey questions. So in fact, in the 2010 data, we have a question where we try to get at whether people understand Wikipedia or not. And it was interesting to note that almost a third believe that there were official editors responsible for what content is on there, which has implications for how people understand the content that's on there and how they approach it. On a survey question, again on the 2010 survey, we also asked about more specifically what people are doing on Wikipedia. And again, pretty much everyone goes on there to read content, but huge variation in who's actually editing the material, which again goes back to this issue of whose voices are really being heard out there. Just finally, I had to put this in here since I'm giving a talk at Google. I talk about this in other talks, but I focus more on the information-seeking search process. But I think this is another area where there are skill issues at hand. So in a paper that we published last year, we looked at how people decide how to trust the content that they encounter. And traditionally, a lot of work on credibility looks at the site features and what the layout's like and who's the source. But what we found, which this quote illustrates very succinctly, is that basically Google ranked it #1. Of course, it's trustworthy. So that was interesting to note because, as we know, Google doesn't rate sites per se based on credibility. There are all sorts of factors that go into how Google rates sites. And while one would hope that in that process credibility comes into play, we know of examples where that's absolutely not the case, that the #1 hits are very problematic. So this is cause for some concern. Just finally, a few words about mobile, because you might be thinking, she hasn't talked about mobile at all, and this is the mobile generation. So it is. I mean, everyone's very wired when it comes to owning a cell phone, for sure. However, again, not in every way. It turns out that in 2009, the majority of the students in this sample had not accessed the web on their mobile phones. And using regression, we were able to show that, in fact, it's the students who already access the web more anyway, who have more autonomy, who have better skills, who are more likely to have access to the web on their mobile phones in the first place. So again, it's a concern about whether we're recreating traditional divides. If we just assume that, oh, well, they're accessing it on their phones anyway and everyone's doing it, when it's not, in fact, the case that everyone's doing that. So why is it helpful to focus on skill? I've shown you that it matters, or hopefully you're convinced by the data that I've showed you that it matters. Well, other things matter too. I've showed you that user background matters. Those are not things that we can really fix or change. Not that some of those things need fixing, but we can't, it's very hard to change people's level of education at some level, or certainly their financial status, economic status, it's hard to change. However, skill is something that is much more likely for intervention, right? So that's something where we could really intervene to help people get better skilled. Obviously, there's the other side of it, which is that information should be supplied to users in a more user-friendly way and whatnot. And there are obviously lots of progress and innovation being done there, but at the same time, people are using these sites and services. We see how they differ in understanding them. So I think it's reasonable to suggest that we try to intervene and improve people's skills. So that's the component of the story, that skill matters, and I think we need to be working on that. So one way to do that is we need more data, understanding how people do these searches, and I know there's obviously work being done here, and I know Dan thinks about that a lot too. Another is intervention, I think, to see what are the ways. So even if we agree, sure, let's try to improve people's skills, we don't really know yet how what's the optimal way to do that? How do we do that? And is it the same across population? Given what I've shown in terms of how different types of people use the internet in the first place, maybe we need different interventions based on type of person, who knows? So that's a question that remains. And then another issue, which I haven't really addressed because we simply lack the data to really get at it, is this final loop back to what are the life outcome implications of these online uses. And here, what's important is to look at, well, how does your skill and what you do online relate to all these different types of outcomes? So to wrap up, you might recall that in 2006, Time came out with Person of the Year as you, because the idea was that everybody was contributing. But hopefully what you'll take away from this talk is that, in fact, it's really just some of you, or more precisely, some of us in this room. So let's not think of it as this universal happy story that everyone is benefiting and taking advantage of all this, or is able to. And partly that's because they lack the skill. So thank you, and I welcome questions.
So we have 13 minutes for questions.
Great.
Can you repeat the questions? So you're going to
Sure. Yes.
That's a great talk. I'm just curious if you've repeated any of these sort of surveys at Northwestern to see sort of school by school effects of that.
So the question is if I've repeated this surveys at Northwestern or other schools to see if these differences exist. And yes, so to the extent, not at the same scale. We did observations of over 100 Northwestern students at a similar time when we did observations of over 100 UIC students. And we surveyed those 109 Northwestern students. There is slight difference, but not huge difference. Some of the factors are hard to track at Northwestern for the reasons actually I didn't point out that Northwestern's not quite as diverse at UIC, but you can probably imagine that it is. So students don't differ as much in terms of their parental education, for example. So I can't really look at the predictors there. But in terms of just the core numbers, they're a little bit higher on average, but they still differ quite a bit. So there's still variation. Did you have your hand up? So the question is, when I was showing the numbers that 20% of students had edited, if I thought that was low or if that was high.
For example, traditional encyclopedias, 10 old white guys probably write those.
Right. So it is definitely important to recognize that compared to, so first of all, I'd like to point out that it's those numbers are true for the men and not for the women. So 10 old white guys, 10 young white guys, that's simplified. But so the story is actually not that different. Now, obviously, more people are contributing to the content today than they were 20 years ago, for sure. But part of the point of showing these data is that there's still difference in who those types of people are who are contributing. And I think, and part of the issue here in pointing out these differences is also that while things may look better, it's important to remember that there are these differences, because if we just walk away assuming that it's all great, then we might really be leaving those people behind. Like before, we knew that it was just those few people. And now if we assume, oh, it's everybody and it's not, then that's a really wrong perception of what's actually going on. I don't deny, though, that it is more democratic, for sure. I just want to make sure that we remain conscious of the trends that we see and who is actually contributing and who isn't.
Now, have you looked much at anonymity online in terms of gender differences there, and when people are contributing this content, is it under pseudonyms or their identities, and whether like maybe controlling for really identifying yourself?
So the question is whether I've looked at to what extent anonymity or synonymous contributions might influence, well, you didn't say that, but that's what I'm assuming you're asking, might influence to what extent people are contributing. And I think it's a really great question, and it's something I've thought about, because I do think that some of the reactions that people get to content is what may have them contribute more or less, so to speak. So I don't know to what extent people have looked at this for online content. I'll give you an example from academic research where, as far as I know, there's some evidence that shows, for example, that when, the journal review process, peer review, you get lots of critical comments. I think there's research that has shown that female faculty, academics are more likely when they get a rejection like that to internalize the critiques and say, oh, wow, I did poorly, I'm not even going to send this out. Whereas on average, the male scholar will say, oh, these reviewers have no idea what they're talking about, send it out, turn it around. And so I think this is a relevant parallel here because it's the question of how do people perceive critical comments they get. And so the way I'm linking it back here is, let's say you make a comment on YouTube and people jump on you and say, oh, you're so stupid, what are you doing? Or you post a video and it gets all negative comments. This would suggest that gender might predict how you react to it, and then that might influence whether you come back to do more of this activity. So I mean, I don't want to say that that's what you were suggesting, but it seems like that's one thing that could be going on here.
Did you include in your surveys whether people contributed to Wikipedia? Well, I mean, that's anonymous, but for other things they were doing, did they?
Oh, so do I have data on it? Sorry. Right, so the question is, do I have data on whether people are contributing anonymously or not? I'm afraid I do not have data on that. I did ask a question. So I've been trying to get at this because it is something I've been curious about for the reasons I just mentioned. And I had a question about the extent to which you've had bad experiences with just aggressive behavior, that kind of stuff. It didn't really show a lot. I mean, there's some gender variation there, but not a lot. So I haven't quite been able to get at that. However, I do have some data that I haven't looked at closely in that way yet, where I have data on sharing photos, videos, writing, images that you created either just privately or publicly. So it's not about whether you're posting anonymously, but it's about whether you're just sharing it with people presumably because you're doing it privately versus publicly, and that could get at that a little bit as well. I just haven't looked at it yet. Yes?
What's the best example of like the most diverse input knowledge base?
What's the best example of the most diverse input for?
Something that exceeds Wikipedia in terms of egalitarianism. What is the best one you found? What are you shooting for?
I think it would be neat if it. Oh, sorry. So what is the best example of contributions to a type of site or service? What am I shooting for? Or what would I like to see? I think it would be great if we didn't see that your background matters, right? That it didn't matter whether you were female or male, or whether you were Hispanic or white, or whether your parents have a graduate degree or just a high school degree. That regardless of that, people are contributing. And it seems that skill is mediating this, so one way to achieve it is to make sure that people are better skilled and understand sites better. So one of the ways people sometimes approach this is to say, well, some people just don't want to contribute. Well, maybe, but my point is that some people might not know how to contribute, and that's why they're not doing it. Yes?
So your earlier made me think of something else as well. And so I remember reading somewhere, though I can't be sure, that women create more complete profiles on, say, Facebook or social networking sites, or it's longer or more thorough. I don't know if that's completely correct, but I remember reading it at some point. But so I guess that made me think of, in terms of like content creation on the web, could you in some ways define your content groups by like basically how easy it is for somebody else to then comment back on it? Like you can post a video and people can comment on it, but nobody can really critique or comment on your Facebook profile, say.
So the question is whether I've looked at content creation in terms of how easy it is to comment on or respond to the content that was created. And the example given was that apparently there's some data to show that women create more complete profiles on Facebook. I'm not familiar with that research. I don't know if it's about more of a safe space because on Facebook, it's, again, the people you know. So it's what we would consider a more private space. And recall that the creating quizzes was actually quite equal between men and women. And again, I think that's pretty much Facebook quizzes. So I don't know if it's about that. But it's an interesting question. Although I feel like the things we had here, I mean, on Wikipedia, sure, someone could erase your change, so that's a way of commenting on it for sure. I'll think about it more, but I think it may partly be related to the whole private, public nature of it. I will say also, in a completely different paper, well, drawing on the same data set, the 2007 data set, we showed that looking at how people use social network sites differently, one of the things we showed was that men were more likely to make new connections, whereas women were more likely to engage in activities that solidified their existing connections. So there are some differences. And again, you might say there too that women are solidifying connections they already have, so there isn't that fear of who might this be or don't know who this is, whereas men perhaps, I don't know if some of it is fear that we talk about what may be lurking outside in the unknown, and that then ends up scaring people away. And certainly the way the rhetoric is framed around those issues makes it more of a concern, I think, often for women, just the way we hear about it. So that's something to consider too, where I would again argue that if we have more skilled people, then hopefully they'd be able to know how they can be safe and not alter the behavior per se, or alter it in a way that still leaves them engaged.
Time for one more question.
No pressure. One last question. Yes.
You mentioned the sort of perception and skill gap between men and women, and that for online skills, women rate themselves lower. I guess I wondered, did you control for variables like amount of experience online and interest online? I wonder if there's something about sort of how societally we were historically sort of pushed men into computers and science, pushed women into arts and things of that nature, where there may be fundamental differences in the percentage of men that actually are excited.
Okay, so the question is whether I look at things like experiences with the internet and interest, but to explain the gender variation, partly because historically there are stereotypes associated with who goes into what areas. So in the regressions, I always control for things like number of years you've been online, how much time you spend online, things like that. I do. And the gender effect is pretty much robust to all that. I do think that there is some stereotype issue going on when it comes to women's self-perceptions, right? So this issue of, well, it's not the technology, it's not women's domain, so it's this stereotype threat literature that I mentioned that would also be related to it. I think, so this then concerns how we think about these things. I think it's interesting because often we talk about the internet though as a very social space, and not so much as a technology per se, so it's curious that it translates to this domain. I will say, as a last note on that point, that a literature review we did as we wrote up that piece showed that pretty much in every domain that has been surveyed, and this is not necessarily technology related, women always rate their skills lower than men. So that's completely consistent. So there's just an issue going on there.
All right, join me. Thank you, Preston.
Thank you.